Okay, good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight with us. It feels quite an exceptional evening. It's after the new regulations. It feels almost like the last time that we can be all together in a room. That is not our living room alone. So it means a lot to us that you're here. Thank you, Karine. Thank you, Karen, for accepting our invitation. Thank you also to whoever is following us on the live stream. We are here tonight to explore a bit in a hopefully interesting way the concept of fluidity. We are in the context of the Pilar ASAP Festival, which is a semi-annual multidisciplinary festival that always has a very narrative program. The Fluidity edition of this year focuses, of course, on fluidity intended in a very, very broad sense. From identity to, mix sciences like tonight. It's a merger where we come from, what we've developed, and all those things that we dream as possible. So this evening here, we're having a short discussion for about an hour with Dr. Karen Celis, who is a researcher professor at the Department of Political Sciences and co-director research of REA, the Research Center of Gender, Diversity and Intersectionality here at the VUB in Brussels, and with Karine Van Doninck, who is full professor at the Department of Biology at ULB and UNAMUR. She's also the principal investigator of the ERC Consolidator Grant, which, funny enough, is called also REA. So I would like to ask you to kindly introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your domain of research. So, Karen, you can go first.
And it works. This is the first device I touched today that actually works. I had quite a frustrating day. Yes, so thanks a lot for the invitation. And it's really, can I echo this, really great to have a live event where we can actually, I'm not going to be this loud. So a live event where we can actually, be face to face and experience an event like this together in the same room. So you already introduced me quite well. So I'm Karen Celis and I do research mainly on the quality of democratic decision making. And I try to look and redefine and redesign democracies from the perspective of disadvantaged groups. So not the political elites, but from disadvantaged groups, and of course their intersectionality, so the intersection of multiple identities that define your structural position in society is very much just my starting point. So from there I look at the quality of democracy, democratic decision-making, the democratic actors, and I try to assess, but also imagine a better future. So I'm also in the business of redesigning democratic institution towards an ideal. So in my kind of sciences, we like to critique and deconstruct, but I'm also in the construction business. And I'm going to talk a bit about that today. Thank you.
Karine?
Thank you. So good evening. I'm also very happy to finally be able to talk with people and see their emotions, even if you are a bit in the dark, but still better than a screen. So I'm a biologist. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm really inspired by nature and how nature can help us understand mechanism. And in my team, we are specialized in studying evolution at the genetic level. So how do organisms adapt to the most extreme environment while changes happen at the genetic level? So we really specialize this, and we take organisms from the environment who have these extreme adaptations, like small rotifers. I'm sure almost nobody heard about it, but these are passionating small microscopic animals that are females. They clone themselves. We can dry them up at any stage of their life cycle. They are dried up for years. We put them in the freezer till -80, and when we add water, they live again. And these are real animals. And so we understand, how do they do? And is drying up the same as having sexual reproduction, to summarize this in 2 words? So we are really looking at nature to understand how evolution happens. And besides that, in my science lab, I also often invite artists to work together with us. And so we really interact, artists and scientists, to also discuss more about these scientist discoveries with artists, to bring it to the general public, but through another way of showing things. Thanks.
Okay, so the first point I would like to touch upon with you is something that came up already in a conversation we had, and sparkled a lot of thought, and is a point about time, and about how fluidity in your different domains is strictly related to the concept of time. In your case, Karine, there is a lot to this concept of things that change or that coexist in a fluidity, in the sense of in the same moment. So our identity and our who we are and how we are represented and how relevant is the way we are represented is related to a concept that something that happens in a at the same time. So our identities are multiple at the same time. While for you, Karine, this concept of fluidity is actually related to evolution, is spread over time. So a same form of life evolve over a long course. So would you like to expand a bit of that? Because you're going to do it much better than I can.
I go first, Karine, or do you want to go first? Well, so moments in time and fluidity. So am I allowed to go one step back and then I come to the point and then I further develop it? Again, to this position of the marginalized groups in society. The traditional way to generate political equality and undo marginalized positions in politics is, for instance, using a gender quota. And you're all familiar with the system of gender quota. What that does actually is reduce your identity to one single dimension. And it fixes it. And then the political system is designed to, capture and entrench that identity in the political system. So gender quota, you have to have X number of women and men on your list. They get elected, and then you have these bodies in parliament, and then we count them, and then we know how political equal your system is. That's very nice, you can count, and then you can compare through time, and you can compare countries and regions, and then you can actually say something about political equality of your political system. But of course, that is not how our political world is like. That is so reductionist of the complexity of our lives. I'm a woman, yes, but I'm also a highly educated white woman. I'm heterosexual. I belong to a certain age group. I'm not going to give that away. But so my identity is built on those intersections. But not only my identity, but also my political interests, my opinions, my perspectives on life and politics. And so there's a huge mismatch between my identity and how the political system is going to respond to my needs. because the political system thinks that if there's a Marine Le Pen, for instance, in parliament, politically active, then I'm represented. But of course, that is not the case. So how does then the political system is able to respond, to be responsive to my political identity that is not only complex, and now I come to the point, but also changes all the time. When university policy is involved, I am affected by that topic in a different way than when, for instance, abortion legislation is on the table. So not all these identity features matter to the same extent at every moment in time in relation to every political topic. So that is the fluidity also at one particular moment in time is a moving target all the time. And so what is politically relevant today in terms of my identity features and how they intersect might well be completely different the other day. And the political system is not able to deal with that fluidity and complexity, which in my field of expertise is more or less is foremost about intersectional identities.
Karine, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so of course I come from the exact sciences, hard sciences. So when we look, of course, at time and evolution, evolution takes a lot of time. And what's really important in evolution is that the basic mechanism of evolution is random. So changes just occur randomly. And with time, and evolution takes a lot of time. That's why we don't see human evolution, even if human evolution has changed a lot over time. At some point, a change can be adaptive, and then it's selected for. And that's not random. But that selection of this characteristic that is important at one specific time, it's because it's just in that environment important. But in another environment, this change would not be selected, which is a bit linking to what you say, that in fact, it's fluid. Your changes can be really helpful in that environment and be really negative in another environment. And so we constantly change randomly, and evolution is just these random processes of changes. Even when you look, and we are studying now at the moment the COVID evolution, these mutations that COVID is undergoing, these changes at the genetic level, it's not that it's going in one direction, it's just changes that happen randomly. But some changes may make the virus more escaping our immune system. So if it gets a change at that specific moment that it helps it to be more effective, it could be selected for. And that change will, of course, increase in frequency. And that's exactly how evolution and adaptation works. But that mutation could be in another environment, not at all selected for. So it's interesting that you really have these changes that are constantly, that are fluid all the time in life, and that depending on where you are or where your opinion is, these changes are relevant or not relevant.
So this randomness is random to a certain point, because in all this randomness something gets fixed. It's no? So there is a
yeah, things can get fixed. I can give another example. For example, if you take, let's say we take a beetle population and it's this green color, but then in autumn, when the leaves come down and it's a brown leaves everywhere, and one of the beetles gets a mutation by chance that the color changes to brown, so that it's a brown color that it gets suddenly. But in autumn, this brown beetle can be much more protected towards predator. Imagine there is a bird. The bird will not find the brown one, but it will find all the green ones. So that brown beetle will start to reproduce, will not be taken by the bird, and that change gets fixed in that moment, in that environment. Mm-hmm. But then again, it could be disadvantageous in another season. In the winter and snow, this could be disadvantageous, so it could be eliminated again. So it's this continuous fluidity in changes that are important in nature. Without changes, there is no evolution, no adaptation.
Okay.
Yeah, and of course, to make a parallel to political systems and how they evolve, you also see there the importance of the changing relevance of certain identity features. For instance, women are, or ethnic minorities, or certain age group of persons with disabilities and so on and so forth. So I call these marginalized groups, and I want to stress, because I'm going to use this concept a lot, these are marginalized groups. They are not marginalized, but they are marginalized due to a very complex set of mechanisms that interact and produce marginalization. So that is a very important footnote that I would like to add here. So, but at some point in time, a political system can also come to the conclusion that they need this exception actually to survive. So, for instance, women have been resisted in politics for a long, long time. But what you see is that at some point, political systems, for their survival, actually need the exception, need the weirdo, the brown beetle, whereas all the other beetles are green. And the system needs the brown beetle for its survival. Because, for instance, when a political system is facing decline, when there's a huge corruption scandal or anything of that kind, when there's an external or internal shock to the system, then it opens up to these exceptions, because then they can send the message like, we are not old and rotten to the bone. We have the ability to change and to reconnect to society and rejuvenate and show a new face. And that is the moment where these exceptional beings in politics then are allowed in. And actually, then they oftentimes also stay. Once they're in the system, they tend to stay, because of course the same rules of power apply then also to them. And the rule of thumb with power is that once you have it, you stick to it, you don't share it.
Of course. So it becomes, if I'm correct, there is a link there into something close to co-evolution. Am I going in the right direction there? So would you mind explaining us a bit about this?
Yeah. So the fact is that we all evolve constantly with our surroundings. So that's this co-evolution that we, in this moment, the best example is host-parasite interaction or host-virus interaction. It's a very important, but we constantly confront it. Everybody is constantly confronted with things that parasitize themselves. And what's interesting in evolution, what you see, is that imagine you have a population where a lot have the same genetic material and the parasites come in. It will easily get to these individuals that are in huge number present. So if it gets adapted to this group, it starts to exterminate these individuals. And the ones the parasite might not reach is the rare one, the few rare ones that the parasite somehow doesn't infect. And so what's interesting in these models of co-evolution is that the rare ones often escape. The problem is that if they escape, at some point they will be the one that will become numerous. And if they become numerous in the population, the parasite will also change, because it's constantly changing, and it can at some point infect the numerous one. And then it's these few ones that are again rare, that gets new mutations that make them rare, that will be the most adaptive. So it's a constant, in fact, we are constantly in a co-evolution where the rare ones may have an advantage compared to the one that are numerous. And it's the same if you take antibiotic resistance and bacteria. Bacteria, they come in, and they are not resistant, or not automatically. And then we take antibiotics, and we might all eliminate them. But at some point, one of the bacteria, by chance, can become resistant, so it will escape. So the rare one will be the advantageous one, but at some point it will be the frequent one. So we are constantly in these changes of frequencies of, when we look at genetic level, we call that genotypes, of these genotypes. And that's what you see in coevolution. Knowing that the rare ones, what you might sometimes call the marginalized one, they are essential, and at some points they are the ones that are the best adapted in our evolutionary models.
Can I jump in on that? Because, yeah, you know, the parallel between, like, if fraud infects a political class, then, of course, it's the outsiders that are not infected by corruption that then, you know, can come to the stage and become numerous, but then, of course, they will, you know, get a disease, a political infection as well. So that is, of course, an evolution that one sees in many political systems. But I would like to add a little thought on in relation to this coexistence, because you actually see that in politics too. And again, when you look at it from the perspective of marginalized groups. So I did a study in Belgium and the Netherlands, and I was studying the gender dimension of the political inclusion of ethnic minorities. Mm-hmm. And what I was intrigued by was the fact that we all know that, okay, things are changing and we have a gender equal government now for the first time in Belgium. But still, the rule is that women are disadvantaged in politics. In almost every political system, you have much more men than you have women. Except when you look at ethnic minorities. There you find political equality between men and women. And that is, of course, very intriguing. How come that you have political equality between men and women when you look at ethnic minorities in politics? That's weird, because we have all these theories to explain women's underrepresentation, but we don't have theories about gender equality in politics. How come? So I investigated this political equality between men and women within the group of ethnic minorities. And what I found out was actually this intriguing mechanism that I labeled the complementarity advantage, where you see that when political elites compose electoral lists, they first look at, okay, who do we have here that really has to have another place on the list at the next elections? Mm-hmm. As the next, this is the group of incumbents, and there you have like the prototypical politician, like the man, 50 years old, grey suit, law diploma, white, highly educated, wife, 2 children. You know, the model political. The model politician. So you have a whole bunch of these guys. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, you cannot go to the elections with such a list, right? So then you have to have a maximum of diversity on these few other places on the list. And then, of course, what you then see is that young ethnic minority women are preferred because they complement to the maximum this bunch of incumbent guys, right? So, and that is an intriguing coexistence also, because they select these women because they create maximum diversity in the few places that they want to give to the non-incumbents. Also, they keep the calm within the parties because these young ethnic minority women are not threatening intra-party power relations. Plus, it gives nice pictures during the electoral campaign, like the old grey wise man with the young ethnic diverse woman. It gives nice pictures and it's not threatening, so it's a full check on the entire list. So that's a really interesting coexistence. Mm-hmm. But a few of these ethnic minority women are going to stay in politics. And they will become part of the incumbents, of the group of incumbents. And then, of course, another mechanism of complementarity advantage will start to play out. So that is a very interesting link, I think, between, you know, evolution and this existence and elimination of majorities, minorities coming in, becoming the majority, and how that then creates new relations of coexistence.
So here, like any reference to the current running for president candidate and his VP candidate is purely
Pure coincidence.
It's just pure coincidence. Okay. Well, that was a lot. Please.
Because we discussed that also last time, but what's interesting is you're saying we're taking these differences, and often it's described as, we all know, we describe the people a bit like they are Africans, here are Asians, here are Europeans, here are Australians. But then, if you look at the genetic level, none of us is 100% European or 100% American. So now that we have done these 1,000 genomes, and much more of humans, so that human genomes have been sequenced. If you now try to look at the map, the genetic map of these humans and the continents, you would not be able to say, all these are the Africans, all these are the Asians. We are a mix. If you would do your own genomic map and you would map it to the people genetic variation of Homo sapiens, you would see you have 30% Asian, 20% African, because we all have African mutations because we all come from there. So nobody is 100% something. So it's interesting because in social sciences, even if it's important to define these groups, if you look at the genetic level, there is none of this grouping of a race or a people belonging to a continent. And it's, for us, and also sometimes surprising scientifically, the meaning of an immigrant, because Homo sapiens comes all from Africa, has migrated in all directions. We are all immigrants. And again, if you would make a genetic map of all this, there is no immigrant. There is no definition scientifically that can match with an immigrant. So even if you say people really relate themselves to their origin, their identity, sometimes it's tricky, because in science, this identity depends on what it is based. Because if we would all start to be based on our genetic code, then these identities would completely change than what they are defined today as African, European, etc.
And the same also holds for sex, right? It's not always all that clear what sex you are. Also, like
we have the sexual organs; they are clear.
No, they're not. They're not all the time. So in many cases, people are born with both and keep both, and so it just depends on which construct you step into or are forced into. Same with age. How do we calculate age? Yeah, from the day that you're born. I know that, but actually, what are people's physical ages differ a lot. So all these criteria seem very, very, objective and measurable. But once you start digging into it, it all becomes very, very, very messy. Yeah. But we as human beings, we don't like that. We cannot cope with that. We like binary things like you're a man or a woman. When a baby's born, the first question is it a man or a woman? When you go to the bank and you open a bank account, they want to know, are you a man or a woman? And it's all the time you have to give your age, your sex, your nationality. We are obsessed, our society is obsessed with boxing people, because that's a way of dealing with insecure situations. Because then we can use that as shortcuts, like who can we trust? But these are all societal constructs that nonetheless have a very deep psychological basis. That is why people actually also get so upset and angry with trans people, because they don't respect the boxes that we need to cope with our insecure environments. So it's a very functional construct to actually survive. So yes, it's absolutely true that it is much more, biology is much more messy than our social constructs, but we spend a lot of time constructing them, and then people like me love to deconstruct.
That's why we should be open to that fluidity, because it's much more fluid. And I always say to randomness, to accept this randomness, the imperfection is still going to perfection, but there is no perfection. We have an amazing eye. Human Homo sapiens is a very effective eye. It's built up on all these imperfections that then have been selected for to get to this. So I always say, give space to this randomness in life and this fluidity in changes that you don't control, that are unexpected. That's why we also get sometimes these unexpected diseases, because these are changes we get and we don't control.
Yeah. There is also a very interesting dichotomy here between that focuses on who are we? Are we the product of biology, or are we the product of culture, or both? And to which extent our biological background and our cultural background actually define who we are, and so define our identity, no?
Yeah, and it's always, in the gender studies, you have this huge debate, nurture, culture, nature, nurture. Oh my God, it's getting late, Friday evening, no wine. That is a discussion that we will never, ever solve. Yes, of course, you have your biological luggage with you, you have your body, and that is the way you experience the world, experience yourself. But then again, it's your interaction with people in society that will define what it means to be a woman, and how you can experience your femininity and your age and your, it's unsolvable. It's unsolvable, the entire discussion. But if you would have like a continuum, like it's all nature versus it's all culture, I would definitely be on the second half of the spectrum, and I would be much more towards the cultural determinant position.
I think we cannot neglect nature. The genetics are there. We are made of the sperm and the oocyte of our mom and our dad in most cases. So that's the genetic we receive with us. And then, of course, we see that even from twins, identical twins, they still evolve differently, certainly if they are put in a different environment. And now there is this new field in biology, which we call epigenetics, is that we always think that these changes that happen at the genetic level are the ones that we transmit, when they happen, of course, in the oocyte of the sperm. But we realize that we can have other modifications outside this DNA that can also be transmitted. And then mothers can also transmit maternal things to their egg that can have an influence. So yeah, there is much more nurture than we scientists try to. We try to explain things and we fit to these genetics, but we realize that there is a lot of the nurture that we not at all control, and that we shouldn't. It's perfectly fine not to control it.
Yeah, and not to control it, and also not to try to explain everything, because there's always this huge slippery slope between explaining and legitimizing.
Oh, yeah.
It's not because you can explain something at a biological level that actually you have, by that explanation is actually the ground for legitimizing power hierarchies, for instance. And that is, of course, something that is actually, that card is played against against a lot of disadvantaged groups in politics, that the difference that is observable is actually then read through glasses that actually put these differences in a hierarchy, and then say, okay, if group A is like this and group B is like that, then that characteristic is actually what a good politician is made of, for instance, or a good leader is made of. And that is a construct. That is no longer the biological explanation. That is something else, and it's so biology is used and misused quite often to legitimize societal constructs that actually advantage specific groups in society.
Yeah, it's often also used to justify behavior, like certain patterns of behavior belong to men because they have testosterone, right? So men must be in that way and women must be in that other way because women are nurturing and they are caring, and because biologically they were designed like that. To which extent these sentences are actually acceptable?
Not. I don't think acceptable. Although there are things, and I'm happy some of friends and family is here, because we often had this discussion, and also more in COVID, is I can get very nervous, for example, as a scientist, when I see that that there are people that don't believe in evolution or that say that humans come from God, and then I'm very strong, this scientist who says, come on, we have so strong proofs of that we come from a bacteria 3.5 billion years ago on Earth, that we are 99% like an ape. What do you need more? I can show you a list of, and which is always interesting because they still say, and we have to be careful as scientists because we always think we have the evidence, is that the evidence is with the tools we use today, which might even be wrong. So in the meanwhile, when you evolve as a scientist, you also start to evolve with your thinking and your writing, where at some point you think you have an evidence, and I have now the experience in my lab that we published a paper that we thought we had the evidence, and that we have to count the counter evidence, so what we wrote is wrong. Mm-hmm. Because the tools were not available at the time and they changed. So I agree, this evidence of scientists, we have to be careful. Even if I think there are some situations where things are very clear, like why do we now, with COVID, also ask the advice of virologists, is because they really have evidences of certain aspects that are important to take into account. So it's always, that's why I think it's a beautiful job tonight, is to bring human and exact sciences together, because there is this connection that often is not made, or where we don't even, exact sciences or hard science, get these critics of these other, of the community, of the entire community on these evidences and how you bring them into a society. And that's where we have to be careful, even now in the situation of COVID. Do we only let the virologists speak, or do we let the community speak? Who is here to now make all these decisions? Should it only be the scientists, or should it be the community?
That's a very good question. I guess that there are many different interests at stake. So every stakeholder should have a word. Or maybe not.
In a political system, how you let
in a political system, in a healthy political system, hopefully.
Yeah, but where do you? Yeah, absolutely. I think. Yeah, this is now I'm way out of my scientific comfort zone. To comment on this situation, like who should be in the decision-making seat now? Of course, the experts are extremely important, but again, this is not only a disease. This is also a societal issue. It's an economy collapsing. It's a cultural sector collapsing. There's all the weaknesses that we had already documented extensively, that are like the weak spots of our society: inequality, violence. These are breaking up big time now. So do I think that, for instance, we should have somebody in the driver's seat, or in the committee that is taking the decisions that will look like I do, like look at the decisions made from the perspective of disadvantaged groups in society? Yes, I would definitely advise that. Like how I really would like to see reflection on how will this measure impact violence against women and children at home? How will this measure impact vulnerable people, the poor? I have a researcher working here in Brussels with the poor, with the homeless people, and she's discussing politics with them. You know, homeless people, like, and how do they think and feel, especially about politics. You know, how they experience the COVID situation has really opened my eyes, because for them, hardly anything changed. Can you imagine? So they are so disconnected and outside of the political system that actually, for them, not that much changed. Of course, it worsened a bit. But it's like, you know, not such a dramatic change as for many of us. So can you imagine, like, the state of their lives in normal times? So that's a huge eye opener. So yes, so the people who are taking the decisions now, they are expert, they are elected politicians and so on and so forth, but they are in a bubble. They are in an identity bubble. They are too much of the same. And so you need other perspectives to be brought in. I think they miss some kind of a critical perspective, looking at the situation from the position of people that are not like them, who do not drive a nice car back home after their meeting. Yeah.
Okay, we went very far, but I would like to go back to something that we mentioned earlier, that is the idea of inclusion. There is this sort of, we're witnessing around the world this sort of a long overdue trend towards a more inclusive society, in which representation is more fair, more representative of the actual reality of the world and its complexity. There is this, we can say it's a trend. It's very slow, but it's a trend, no? So how does that fit actually into an evolution discourse? How, because we are taught in schools that, and this is something already touched upon, is we are taught in schools that the very basic law of nature is that the strongest survive and the weakest are disregarded, eliminated, because that's how it works, and there is space only for the strongest. How does this sort of political and societal evolution actually reflect in the evolution of our planet?
Yeah, so as I said before, the definition of survival of the strongest, we have to be careful. What is the strongest? Mm-hmm. Again, it's, as I said before, it's really strongest in evolutionary theory really means the one that is best adapted at that specific time. And as in my example I was showing, it could be the rare one, the one that gets something very unique and very different that is sometimes the best adapted. So when we say survival of the fittest is really the one that at that certain point has a change that gives him an advantage compared to the other. And then, of course, this advantage, how you look at that, the advantage is at that moment. So evolution never goes into a direction. There is no predisposition in evolution saying you should go that direction. Mm-hmm. So it's really this rareness is sometimes the best way, which could be comparable to a minority. I mean, being rare in evolution is really advantageous in this host-parasite coevolution, which is a beautiful example. So I think really this is a general term, the strongest and the survival of the fittest. But of course, if you look more in these evolutionary dynamics, you see that these changes, which I explained before, of rare and abundant is also a very important aspect.
Okay. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, because and that's something also we discussed in preparing for this, is that of course when you take this step back, you see this broader evolutions through time, towards more inclusion, for instance. But of course, when you are, in it, when you are, in the daily business of politics and how it works on the ground, of course, you don't see those bigger trends. Then politics looks like, okay, politicians promise something during the elections, and then they do something else in between elections, and then they get criticized, they get re-elected, they get deselected, and so it looks like it's all very messy, and that as if there is no, goal or no point that systems are evolving towards. But when you take a step back, actually you see in many parts of the world quite similar evolutions, more inclusion, but then, for instance, also the widespread of the representative democracy is also one of these general trends, or representative electoral systems. So you see broad trends nonetheless, which is very fascinating. Mm-hmm. And of course, now we can explain much, because like all social movements, for instance, are very well connected. So they jointly strive for, on a global level, even for certain aims. But this was for long not the case. So it's very intriguing why political systems co-evolve to a certain extent in similar directions.
Yeah, that's a discussion we also had about this short-term, long-term, where I always, short-term, there are catastrophes in nature. So you are sometimes confronted with suddenly a short-term change that you have to cope with, and that can change your system completely. Your ecosystem can suddenly change completely because of this catastrophe, which we call a really short-term change. But if you look in general, it's long-term, it's slow changes. And we had these discussions where I was asking you, why should I have the impression the politics is only short-term thinking, while we should be long-term thinking. But like you said, there are these trends that you see that somehow in political systems, things that seem sustainable are evolving, are being kept. Although I still think about, should a politician only be there for 5 years? Because then in a 5-year period, he really wants to do what he has said or try to do, and he's very focused on being re-elected and on what is promised and can be done in 5 years, which I call sometimes short-term. For some aspects in our society, it's still short-term, 5 years. And that there should be a thinking also of some aspects in our society take much more time to change, are long-term, and how much this is not enough, I think, sometimes included in our political systems.
This short-term thinking is of course obviously a huge problem, but it's a built-in problem of our democracies, because of course we want to hold our representatives to account on a regular basis, and not in, say, 20 years' time from now. So we want them on a short leash, so to speak, so that we can control them. So, and there's this beautiful concept, myopia, in political science, that actually describes this short-term thinking. But then, like politicians do try to have this longer-term perspective, and for instance, constitutions are one of the few tools that political systems have to entrench values on the longer term, like political equality between men and women is one of the things that we have embedded in our constitutions, and how that then states that it's a game that is fixed, and it's clicked and into the constitution. So that won't change that easily. And to really push this long-term thinking, there are already a few constitutions in the world that actually build in the rights of the unborn generations. So they actually have their rights too in the constitutions, or the rights of nature that are built into our constitutions, so that they cannot be harmed by politicians that have short-term goals. So that's one of the very unsatisfactory tools that we have, but yeah, they're very exciting, I think, like this idea of having the rights of future generations and nature built into the constitutions. And then actually people can sue the government based on that right of future generation, which I think is a very interesting thing to do.
Definitely. So unfortunately we must start wrapping up, but I have a last question for you before opening to the public if someone has more questions. My question is the obvious one now. We started this conversation talking about fluidity, which is it turns out to me became a very surprising concept, because when I started researching for this panel, the first thing I did was going online and type fluidity definition in Google. And I very quickly realized that is a term that is appropriated by so many different domains, and each one of them has their own interpretation and their own use of this word. So what is your definition of fluidity as an evolutionary biologist and as a political scientist?
Well, I would definitely tie it to this idea of intersectionality, so that your identity is actually, and your political perspective, opinion, interest, dream, what have you, is actually determined by this intersection of different identity features, and that the extent to which that specific combination matters is context and time and space dependent. So it's not only your identity feature that interact in very fluid and messy ways, but also how they are politically relevant is actually changing, is a moving target. So that is for me fluidity. And then the big question for me then is like, how do we design political institutions that actually can cope with this fluidity, with this intersectionality, and take that flexibility into account. And I've written a book about that, so I hope that one day I can explain a bit more about that.
Yep, yeah, we'll spend a word about it.
Yeah, I think people now obviously see how evolutionary biologists see fluidity is, of course, this continuous, unexpectedly change. I think that would, for me, be certainly the definition in fluidity. And in fact, it's funny because these organisms, these rotifers, one of the organisms we are studying, these are females that clone themselves. So you would think they are a genetic clone of themselves, which we call them often an ancient asexual scandal or an evolutionary scandal, because how can you evolve and adapt, and they adapt to the most extreme environments in Antarctica, in ice, in lichens, in mosses, we find them everywhere, if they are just a clone of themselves. And in fact, we have shown through experiments that they are not a clone of themselves, none of them. So even what we describe as a clonal organism, in fact, we realize that by drying up, every time they dry up, this genetic material gets broken into 1,000 pieces, and they have to put all these puzzles together. They never put it perfectly the same together. So there is this continuous change, unexpectedly, that happens. So even in these organisms that are described as these clonal organisms, like bacteria too, like viruses, they are never, never the same. So they replicate, they change, they reproduce, but there is this continuous flow of changing.
Great. Thank you very much. We still have a few minutes, just 2 or 3 minutes for a question, if anybody has something to share. No? Yes. 1, 2. Yes, please. We can't pass the mic in the room, of course, for COVID safety, so speak loud, please.
With a mask.
Yes. Yeah.
It's interesting when you approach fluidity more from the continuum aspect of the genetic and the discrete aspect of politics. I just want to comment that there is a philosopher in France, his name is Tristan Garcia, the University of Lyon, who is making synthesis of the two. He just wrote a book called Nous, so us in English. Very interesting because he makes the link between the two approaches that you just made. He sits in the middle, in a way. And it's a really interesting read. So, just a
Thank you very
Thanks.
much. Nous. Nous. Us. Garcia.
Garcia, nous.
We had another one.
I was going to ask, how much do you think social media nowadays influences change in politics, or how do you think it makes things happen quicker, or do you think governments try and push it aside because you have so much misinformation on social media? But do you think it helps benefit changing government politics?
Well, it definitely speeds up politics. It speeds up politics, but it at the same time that it speeds up change, it at the same time also speeds up the undoing of that change. So it's actually quite destabilizing for the moment, but that is not because of the social media themselves, but it's because of the fact that actually our political system is not adapted to it yet, and that will come for sure. That is a coexistence that is also going to happen, like politicians with this new social media and the speed of politics. That will definitely change a lot, and we see that already. But it changes the format. I'm still looking for the bigger change on the level of content of politics, because I think it might just be that we experience it in a different way. But again, when we give it some time and then we look back, okay, what was the impact? Maybe it was more about how politicians communicate and society and people communicate with politicians, but that actually that there's not a lot of traces left.
Yes.
You were discussing how biology is often, from some people, some conservative people, used as an argument to not progress or not foster the progress in this culture of fluidity. Is there a way that science can be helpful for this arguable change, cultural change? Do you see science playing a role or not?
Well, that's yeah. I would stay away from the entire debate. So from going to biology, for instance, to find arguments or explanations for something that is happening at a societal level, I would completely stay away from that. Because my brother-in-law. Well, my ex-brother-in-law, actually, he was an ornithologist. And we had these huge family fights on a Sunday afternoon, like these horrible family fights, like you are supposed to have a nice Sunday afternoon together and you end up fighting with your entire family. And so he was an ornithologist, and he was explaining all the time how it works with the birds. He used these arguments like the copulation between the male and the female bird to explain to me why women should not be in politics. And we had this horrible fight. But then years afterwards, I came across this bunch of articles where a lot of these so-called obvious, objective observations about you know, the male bird this and the female bird that were actually completely turned upside down, and actually they found out that it was actually the female bird that copulated with a lot of male birds to make sure that her genetic material would pass on to the future generation. And in the past, that was what the male birds were supposed to do. So they had, you know, had to copulate with a lot of female birds so that their genetic material. But then it was proven that, and then I was tempted, like, shall I call him back and say, now I have the proof that actually you were wrong, and this is because we have more female scientists, that we now also have a different reading of these so-called objective facts. And then I thought, like, oh, we will end up in another family fight on a Sunday afternoon, throwing our cake at each other's faces instead of having a nice Sunday afternoon. So, yeah, and this discussion would have gone on forever. So no, I don't think that we should look at biology to.
I would totally agree. What you describe, it's scientifically proven, extra per paternity, and in fact in nature it's full of this, and it makes sense. So the female is the one that chooses the partner, because she, if you look in evolution, the oocyte is the one that has all the food for the embryo. So we have a few oocytes, but they are big. I always say the woman is in the quality and the man is in the quantity. You have a lot of sperm, and then you have a few oocytes. And because we have all the food for the embryos. So somehow it's interesting, because in evolution it's always been the female that has chosen the partner, and the males, they are fighting to get to the partner because they have a lot of sperm to give. The female doesn't have many oocytes, so she better choose the better partner to be sure that her descendants have the best genetic material. And so a lot of, if you look at the copulation and sexual reproduction in nature, most of the females are polygamous. Monogamy is really not the typical thing in nature. And so it's surprising that, like you say, we shouldn't look into biology, but we could think about our system. Why are we so strongly on, and in many of our societies, on that monogamy? Are we so strongly putting rules that in nature it's the opposite that seems to work? So I would not say that we shouldn't look to... I don't say that biology should define the rules, but we could certainly look into it to understand also these communities of these animals. Look at ants, look at so many communities in nature that are very interesting, even at the social level. I mean, ants, this social system of the queen, the workers, the reproductive caste. Some don't participate in the reproduction and still help. This is a whole phenomenon of altruism. Altruism and kinship in nature is often there. Would we be able to get that in our society? So I think nature can tell us a lot about how societies work. So I think it would be interesting that our politicians sometimes look more into what works in nature.
Definitely. The more they learn, the happier I am. Absolutely so. But for me, this is foremost an argument to also have diversity in academia, at universities. Because if you have like a bunch of you're homogeneously socialized people, like, I'm really sorry, I'm not wanna stigmatize here, but white men scientists looking at those objective facts, but all with the same nurturing, you know, the same ideological way of looking at things, because that's how they were raised. They will all see the same thing. Whereas if you also have diversity in your own research team, maybe there are also other perspectives that can be brought in to actually enrich the observation of the fact and how that then is read, and how many alternative readings are then also checked, verified, falsified. So that is, for me, this is foremost a sign that we need diversity in research teams, like we do in politics. Because objectivity, of course, you know, and especially in our fake news times, it's very important to hang on to objectivity, but we also must admit that we are always also humans that are doing the scientific reading of things, and there might be mistakes, and we have to have the good tools to correct our mistakes, but we also have to have the right brains to correct our mistakes. And for me, the right brains is a diversity of brains, a cognitive diversity.
But we should maybe quickly make the link with art then, diversity. If we look at the artist Koen van Mechelen, he has been crossing chickens from all over the world. And he has shown that the best hybrids are the ones that come from the most diverse continents, because they mixed, less inbreeding was creating. They were making much stronger chicken if we diversify the mixing, which in human population we do maybe less, because we have the tendency to reproduce with people of our close community, which I agree, diversity is the basis that is needed.
Okay, I'm really sorry, but we have to stop here. It's unfortunate we're going in extremely interesting directions. But thank you very much. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karine, for joining us this evening. It's been great. Karen has just published a book, by the way, she just mentioned.
And the title
2 words, 3 maximum.
Oh, yeah, but I'm not gonna. The title is Feminist Democratic Representation, and we're gonna launch the book soon on Facebook. So if you look for it, you will find it.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to have a very quick change of stage, and in a few minutes there will be the very first public presentation of Tales of Entropy, which is very new production. Is the result of the collaboration with Guillaume Treasure, who is a doctor in specialized in biopolymers, and I know that may not sound the most interesting thing in the world, but it is. Maybe not the most, but it's beautiful. So I think you have to stay seated at your place. I'm not sure you can move around, but in a few minutes, the show will be on. Thank you very much.